Welcome to, on the other hand, and welcome to the newest subscribers. Once upon a time, there was a guy in college who was on a quest to find an unbiased news source. Little did he know, such a thing doesn't exist, but don't despair, he did find more than he set out for. In talking about bias, I'd first like to pull from a video put out by Viva Frei, a Canadian YouTube lawyer.
But I do think that a lot of people improperly confound having an opinion with having a bias. And while having a bias can affect one's opinion, having an opinion does not necessarily mean that one has a bias. An opinion is a conclusion that one draws from a set of facts. A bias is the perspective through which they gather those facts. A bias is a perspective. They are blinders. They are the way in which someone sees the world, which can in turn and probably necessarily will impact or influence their opinions. And I bring this back to the practice of law. Good lawyers will have a position. They will not have a bias. And what do I mean by that? I'm not going to reduce this to a game of semantics, but it is nonetheless useful to look at the actual definition of bias. Hey Siri, what's the definition of bias?
As a noun, it means inclination or prejudice for or against one person or group, especially in a way considered to be unfair. Be unfair.
Be unfair.
Do you want to hear the next one?
Yes, please.
As a noun, it means a direction diagonal to the weave of a fabric.
That one was totally irrelevant. An inclination or prejudice for or against another person or group, especially in a way to be considered unfair. And it is the unfair aspect of bias that is its defining characteristic. Bias is when someone treats two sets of facts, two individuals, two groups, differently based on their own prejudice. A prejudice which incidentally can be either for or against that person. And that's where political bias comes into play.
So if everyone has bias, how do you tell what your biases are? This is similar to a question my wife posed to me recently, asking how I knew and trusted that the news sources I listened to were giving me accurate information. Because if you're biased and don't realize it, you can end up like Carlos Maza from Vox on this video he did on media bias.
In an ideal world, political journalism looks like this. On either side, you've got the parties, fighting for the attention of the press. And in the middle, you've got journalists, sorting through what's important and what's just partisan bullshit. This is called gatekeeping, and it's one of the most important things journalists do. Political operatives can spin whatever talking points they want, but ultimately it's the journalists who decide what's newsworthy enough to pay attention to. But that is in an ideal world, and we don't live in an ideal world, we live in hell. And in hell, there's Fox News. Fox exists in this weird in-between space, because it claims to be a news organization, but it's essentially a Republican front group.
Later in the same video, he even had the audacity to say this.
There's no equivalent to this on the left, and that creates what Matt calls a hack gap.
So, if you believe Fox News is unique in its position and political function, do I have a bridge to sell you? Now, you might be asking, how do I have the authority and assurance to say that this Vox video is horribly inaccurate and biased? Maybe I'm the biased one. Here's where we get the resolution to my little story. I present Allsides.com, not a sponsor. This is a really cool website I wish someone had told me about earlier in trying to figure out my own political opinions and favorite news sources. The site takes the current news and has links to 3 different sources covering the subject, one right, one left, and one center. Now you might ask, how do they identify what source has what bias? For that, I'll direct you to their explanation, but the TLDR is they do blind bias surveys. Anyway, here's a chart that Allsides has produced to quickly identify bias in the most popular news outlets. As I might point out, Vox, from the earlier video, is here. Some well-known sources are NPR, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, CNN, Fox, and the Washington Post. Anyway, it's interesting to look and see who you normally listen to and where they fall. It's also interesting to note that Fox is a major news network on the right, and CNN is a comparable news network and is a mirror image on the left. Also on the left is ABC, CBS, and MSNBC. If you think that none of these left-leaning outlets, quote, claim to be a news organization, but are essentially Democratic front groups, in a comparable way to Fox, again, this bridge is a great sale, I promise. Anyway, my high school civics teacher once said, but I was too dumb to actually internalize it apparently, listen to things on both sides and the truth is probably somewhere between. So currently, I listen to NPR, The Hill, which is center, but their bias is they're populists, huge Bernie buffs, and they also like Trump. The Daily Wire. Shapiro is the most famous, but I often prefer Klavan for both his sarcasm and his wisdom. And I do my best to watch Vox videos, as well as the CNN TV at work when I'm heating up lunch. And The Blaze has some good partner channels here on YouTube, and Tim Pool is a great resource here on YouTube as well. He's a center-left populist sort of a guy. This all comes down to the fact that you can't count on Vox to be unbiased. They kind of proved that already, but just because someone is biased doesn't mean they can't be trusted. It just means you need to take things they say with a grain of salt. Or a heaping tablespoon in some cases. Anyway, I hope you learned something, and as always, thanks, hope you enjoyed. And if you did, consider subscribing and hitting the bell so you'll get notified for new uploads.